Welcome to this 26th day of December, this feast of Stephen. You ever wonder about the carol Good King Wenceslas? This is the day that the king and his servant went out to serve the poorer people in their community. St. Stephen being the first Christian martyr, and that's why we celebrate his death right after Christmas. Anyway, that's not what I'm talking about this morning. I want to talk about the gospel this morning that is the story of Jesus as a child. I'm always kind of disappointed that if you're following the lectionary, the only time we get to look at Jesus as a child is a Sunday right after Christmas, where everybody's kind of exhausted and not really wanting to do anything with church anyway. So the kids miss this really fantastic opportunity to hear about someone close to their age. And adults miss this opportunity to look at Jesus a little more human than often we do in church. Most of the problem with how we view Jesus is that we view him through the resurrection. We view him backwards, essentially. And that's understandable because there is no documentation of his early life. There's no school records, there's no birth records. None of that would have been done anyway, but we expect because Jesus was such an important person in history that there would be documentation. In fact, a lot of the arguments against Jesus even existing is because we don't have any paperwork to prove that it happened. It's a circular argument that really doesn't fit our knowledge of history because Jesus wouldn't have been recorded. In fact, he could have lived and ministered and died, and no one would have known the difference. How we know him is through Easter, through resurrection, and through a bunch of people in the few hundreds of years following his death who actually wrote down their experiences of Jesus. And Luke being, or the person who wrote Luke being one of them. And he wrote down this story that is not shared anywhere else of Jesus as a child, as a young teenager. Now, to put that in a little bit of context of the day, Hebrew folks at that time in history didn't celebrate birthdays the way we do now. They didn't mark the years as anything special. In fact, that's one of the reasons why it's not until Christianity becomes the mainstay in Roman culture that we start even to recognize Christmas, because birthdays were just not that big a deal for celebrating. But they did celebrate the transition of puberty, the moving from being a child to being an adult, around 12, 13, 14, depending if it was a boy or a girl. Jesus was in that transition time, and that's where the story comes from, moving from child to adult. They had no concept of teenager at the time. In fact, they rarely had a concept of child at that time in history, but they knew that a child did not have the responsibilities or the opportunities that an adult had. So that transition happened in the 12, 13, 14-year range. And Jesus, being in that range, had the opportunity to travel when his parents went to Jerusalem, either with his father, with the rest of the men, or with his mother, with the rest of the children. Both were completely acceptable for him. That's why we can have a story where Jesus' parents didn't even know he was missing until they get to setting up camp that night. It wasn't safe to travel in family units or as individuals, so they traveled in these caravans, these walking trains essentially. A few carts here and there, but generally people traveled by foot. So it's completely understandable, even if it's completely horrifying from a parent's perspective, that they didn't check in with each other. But they didn't back in the day. They just trusted that it was going to happen. So it wasn't until that night when Mary and Joseph finally reconnected that they realized neither one of them had Jesus. And they rushed back to Jerusalem, not being the least bit concerned about what the dangers that might befall them on the trip back. I mean, that was the reason they were traveling in caravan to start with, and they'd been traveling during the day. So on the way back, you can only guess, really, the panic as parents, like, where along the way did we lose him? And they rushed back and they found him in the temple. Now, also in there's two interesting things out of this that I really find. One is, Jesus is a full-on snippy 13-year-old teenager. There's no other way to describe his response to his parents. And no matter how much we try to romanticize it or explain it away, he was snippy. He was offhanded. He was flippant with people who were in absolute panic about himself, as if everybody should know how he viewed the world. So even though they didn't have a concept of teenagers, they had teenagers. So they understood what it was like to have contempt for their parents who didn't understand everything that they were thinking without any explanation or consideration. And we get an opportunity right then and there to see Jesus, the human being. So that's the problem with seeing Jesus through resurrection, is we only ever see the Lord, Christ, the Messiah, the King, the um, high on above person who embodies God's presence everywhere he goes. We never get to see the human. And I think it's one of the things we suffer from as Christians. We're so focused on the glory, but we miss the humanity. And the church took pains for centuries to work out that detail. And we just toss it off because we don't know how to stay in Jesus the human. And the story really kind of forces us to do that. The second thing I think is very interesting about this story is that it tells us Jesus was surrounded in the temple by all of these people who were really interested in this child and what he could say and what he could teach them about Christ, about God. Now, this is the same group of people, or at least the same community people who would just 15-ish so years later want him dead because he was causing a ruckus. But like so many child geniuses, the adults of that time don't see what's coming. They just see this absolutely amazing child in front of them who can do all these great things, talk about all these great things, have this incredible talent, and that's all they focus on. They don't focus on the person beside it. So in many ways, Jesus is kind of hit by a double whammy. The educated officials don't see him as a real person. We as faithful Christians don't see him as a real person. The only people who see him as this person, this flesh and blood kid who didn't check in with his parents before he decides to do something. I mean, he would have known his parents were leaving that day. What was he thinking? They have to deal with this kid, this snotty kid who tells them, "Well, what do you think? Of course I'm going to be here." How do we then take that story and try to bring the humanity back into Jesus, get out of Easter Sunday and get into Jesus as a 13-year-old? What can we learn about God and about Christ, about Jesus as a human being, before the titles took over, before we treated worship as an act of reverence as opposed to an act of respect, which is what the word actually means? Who is this human person? Who is Jesus to us? How accessible is Jesus to us? Some churches throughout history have made it impossible for their people to get in touch with Jesus directly. They've wanted to put priests and saints and all sorts of other people in the way, that none of us are attainable, none of us are able, none of us are good enough to talk to Jesus directly. And that's never the experience Jesus ever wanted us to have. Throughout all of the gospel, all of the teachings of Jesus, he's always saying, "Come to me, come talk to me, sit with me, be part of me, stay awake with me, be ready for me, wait, I'm coming." And this week we have an opportunity to do that, to sit with Jesus. What would he have told the people in the temple? We're not actually given any information. But given that we do see Jesus' ministry in other places, what do you think he was talking about in that temple with all these people who had spent their lifetimes learning from the Torah? Personally, I think he was talking about how to have that relationship. One of the additional issues is that we inherited a Hebrew culture that kind of kept a distance between God and people, and God always trying to overcome that and not quite being there, because we are taught culturally, instinctively, to keep God up high and away. But Jesus says very clearly, "Of course I was in my Father's house." Now, Father is the clue in there. Jesus trying to teach these men who had spent so much of their time, probably their teaching time, trying to get people to see God in awe. And Jesus wants them to see God as an approachable parent, as someone who is there, as his own earthly parents come in through the door, scared out of their mind, wondering where he is. He's showing the world through this story, through the author of Luke, through his interactions with his own parents. He's showing the world how we're supposed to relate to God. And of course, being in God's presence is just merely sitting and talking. It's not grand. We don't have to have the right number of candles, or the right words, or think ourselves good enough or not good enough. We don't have to dress in the proper way. None of those. That's all social barriers. Jesus was trying to teach us that being with God is a matter of conversation. The only thing Jesus could offer these men, they knew the scriptures. They knew the theology of their people. And Jesus was raised in that theology, so he wasn't going to teach them anything that was particularly outside of it. And the Hebrew culture was incredibly based in a social justice concept of God by this time. But he was trying to teach them relationship and relatability. On this day after Christmas, spend some time just thinking about God in relationship, in connection, as your best buddy sitting by you on the sofa, or as someone you want to share coffee with or a glass of tea. That's the God that Jesus tried to get us to understand. That's the God that would have people 15 years from now turn from being amazed at this child to wanting to see him dead. The relationship with God as a personal connection is absolutely revolutionary. It is so much easier to control people when we control their access to God. But Jesus once done away with that. God is there for everyone. There is no barrier. God is the loving caretaker who is with us through everything, every crisis, every celebration, every joy. God is not someone to put on a cross and leave there, or put in a manger and leave there. God is the relationship with a snippy 13-year-old who is far too flip with his parents. But God is in that moment. I'm in my Father's house is something we can all experience, no matter where we are. Find that relationship. Find that time today to just think about how you can be part of that. Try to rid yourself of all of these grand titles and statements, and really be able to sit with Jesus. The day after Christmas is actually kind of good in that regard. The pressure is off, the energy of the day is down, the quietness of the new day can be with us as we sit and realize we are all in our Father's house. And we can be snippy if we want to be. It doesn't matter. God is sitting there with us. God is with you every part of your walk.